What's going on, everybody? This is George Khalife, and it's episode 15 of Let's Grab Coffee. Today, I'm joined by Darrell Pinto, Research Director at CVCA. Very excited to talk to Darrell. He has a very, very interesting background. He's worked at TSX before, Toronto Stock Exchange, which is where I work. He's had roles with Thomson Reuters. He's lived across the world in major cities like Toronto, New York, London, Shanghai. Very excited just to talk about the entrepreneurial ecosystem, the capital raising environment in Canada, and what Darrell is seeing. Darrell, thanks for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Appreciate it. So to the audience, if you can give us a quick sort of snapshot of who you are and your background, that'd be great.
Sure. Well, let me start with what I do right now.
Sure.
We're sitting here in the office of the Canadian Venture Capital and Private Equity Association. But I have a long history of working in different organizations. I started my professional career at the organization George mentioned, on the floor of the Toronto Stock Exchange, when there was still a physical trading floor. By far the most exciting job I've ever had in my life. And I've done many things, management consulting. I've worked at the Institutional Limited Partners Association, in the pharma industry, and I love being back now in the private capital ecosystem.
And so you brought up TSX. Very interested to ask, how were the days on the trading floor?
I remember my first day. My first day was nerve-wracking because I was a history and a philosophy graduate coming into the Toronto Stock Exchange. I knew nothing about finance. My path of acceptance into that trading floor job was 40 words a minute typing speed. Because at that time the trading floor was going to be closed, and a lot of people were leaving for job security, and they were hiring students just to be able to fill a short 6-month assignment until the floor closed. So they brought on board people who just wanted to work on the floor and train them, and I was like a sponge, so everything I could. And that program or that project got delayed a few years, so I was a bit lucky, but it was a great foundation for me to then jettison into other parts of the exchange. I worked in the training department and finally in the research area. So I was there for 10 years in total in different departments. And I saw a lot of change during that time with the exchange, going from physical trading floor to electronic. There were many acquisitions made by the TSX at the time. We used to have regional stock markets in Alberta, Vancouver, and those are now all part of the TSX, or TMX now, TMX umbrella.
So it's interesting. A lot of your background is in capital markets. You did bring up the fact that you're a philosophy/history major from Western, I believe.
That's right.
Right. For a lot of people watching this, especially just I guess general audience at large, when they think of history, philosophy, there's often a disconnect between obviously that and finance, and I think people often see it as a barrier. Like, how can you have that major and get into cap markets, especially doing what you do? How did you transition?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, George. And I have to tell you that the traditional path is clearly not start with history and philosophy into finance. And the reason I chose it was because I loved it. I was actually in computer science in my first year and realized that this is not the thing I want to be doing for the rest of my life. I loved my history and philosophy classes and made the decision I was going to do something I enjoy without a view to what I was going to do later on in life. And then I struggled with a graduate. After graduating, there was a recession, and I had this history and philosophy degree, which was not very marketable for me. So for 2 years, I kind of wandered around doing different things, mostly part-time and assignments, short-term assignments. And I got a lucky break with that floor job on the Toronto Stock Exchange. And I kind of made my career from that point on. But I would tell everyone that I in no way regret the history and philosophy degree. What it has given me is a really broad-minded foundation in whatever endeavor I've done, from capital markets to pharmaceuticals to consulting. It's given me a broad way to look at a problem and be able to dissect it and problem solve. And when I did my MBA much later at Rotman, one of the enduring things I picked up was the dean had done a lot of research on what makes a person successful in the long run. And he had made many hires over the course of his career. He always used to keep their resume of people that he hired and people that he didn't hire in his drawer. And once a year, he would pull those out, and he would just kind of reflect on where these people were in their careers. And the amazing stat for a guy that was pretty bright was that he had a 50-50 shot at getting the right candidate in the long run. He made mistakes just like everyone else. What his research was telling him, that people with a broad start in their undergraduate years, some arts or social science background, then went into business, were far more successful in the long run. And it kind of validated what I had done, although I didn't feel at that point in my career, didn't feel like I made the right choice. It just happened to be lucky accidents for me.
So if you look back, and these are great pointers, and I'm sure anybody listening with that sort of background, values that. But if you look back now to Darrell at say early or mid 20s, would you have thought that this would be the career path that you were going to take?
Absolutely not. I went to Western and did my undergraduate history and philosophy. I never once walked into the Ivy School of Business. Never once in the 4 years that I was there. So business was completely foreign goal for me back then.
So what made you get into the business side more so, like pursue your MBA and then?
Yeah. So while I was working at the Toronto Stock Exchange, I had an amazing mentor.
Okay.
And one of the pieces of advice he gave me, because he sort of saw in me the sort of the drive and the ambition, and I certainly wanted to work in capital markets. And he said to me, "Listen, you have this history and philosophy degree, but you need something else. You need another formal notch, like a CFA or an MBA, if you're going to stay in this industry and climb the ladder." So that's what sort of seeded me with the idea of doing my MBA. And while I was kind of researching, whether to do one and where to do one, I was talking to a lot of people with MBAs, including one woman who worked at the Toronto Stock Exchange.
Wow.
I think she's actually still there, Eleanor Fritz. But I asked her, "What's your advice?"
Yeah.
And she said to me to save my money, not to do an MBA, but learn how to have a conversation. And I thought at the time, I can't put that on my resume, and thanks very much, but I'm going to go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
But in hindsight, it was the best advice I ever got. It really was, because when I see successful people and interact with them, regardless of what their pedigree and degrees are, they really can relate to other human beings, no matter what their title, no matter where in the world they're from, to be able to just have a conversation with them. Kind of like what you're doing right now.
Yeah, no, it's very true. And I think I mentioned this before, but there's a book called Humans Are Unrelated. And the whole premise, especially in an era of huge sort of technological advancement, the biggest driver right now, I think that the author was pointing to was, I guess the basic human tenets are the ones that are going to be the most valuable, say 5 to 20 years from now. Empathy, creativity, just human connection, like all the things that you're highlighting. And I think EQ is probably the thing that's least taught in school. Both high school and university, we focus a lot on IQ and not so much on EQ. What was it for you? So given that advice, how did you sort of leverage that, and how did you actually sort of put it to use?
It really, for me, was sort of an accidental path over time. I've just been a great observer. As an introvert, I observe a lot of detail that other people don't pick up, and I've just watched successful people. I guess the best teacher in that regard, when I left the exchange, I worked for a small research boutique firm called McDonald & Associates. And Mary McDonald was the CEO there. She was just a spitfire of a personality. Everyone in Canada in private equity and venture capital knew her, loved her. Her ability to be able to connect with any human being. There are still people today, senior people in industry who were junior when she was around, and they talk about her with amazing love and respect. So she would drag me to these meetings, and I would just watch her interact with people. It was an amazing way to learn. The best non-degree I have, I think, is with Mary.
Really?
What she taught me.
So, and you point to something interesting: introvert / detailed, or I guess detail-oriented, but you have an eye for detail, right? Very analytical. Was that always something with you? Like, did you feel that was a trait, or something that you built, I guess, more towards?
I think it was always a trait. If you had met me 20 years ago, I really would probably not initiate a conversation with you. I was a shy person.
Wow.
I think most introverts are. And I always looked at that as a bit of a weakness, because in this industry, especially in this industry, you have to be outgoing, you're networking. And I wasn't that. I mean, I was quiet. I was alone observing other conversations until I read a book by Susan Cain called Quiet. And what she did was look at introverts and how they approach the world and how they approach any kind of problem in general. And there are a lot of famous introverts, everyone from Martin Luther King to there's a whole list that I can't probably name off right now. But the way we see the world, we do pick up on observations that extroverts typically don't. The way we think through a problem is we've got to get the perfect solution before we open our mouth. And that's why we're so quiet. We're kind of formulating what we're going to say. And what Mary taught me in terms of how to move the needle away from being so quiet is that sometimes I've got to think through my problem solving out loud. You know, not to be afraid of that, because I don't have to wait until I get the perfect formulation of an idea before I start speaking. So for me, it's been a gradual comfort level being increased with just being able to articulate ideas, even half-baked ideas, and just growing in confidence there. And the other funny thing is, this week I've started getting curious about improv. So I've done 2 drop-in improv classes.
That's right, you were telling me that, yeah.
And you talked about human relations and how, you know, we build off of EQ. Those experiences, those 2 drop-in improvs have been amazing ways to be able to see that in action.
Sure.
When you're trying to riff off of someone else, not really knowing what they're going to say, and you've got to come up with that next line, paying attention to their body language, making eye contact, that's a huge part of that. You really play off their energy.
Right.
Just like you do in a conversation. And I'm actually learning how to do this a lot better, even though I think I'm good at it. It's a bit of fun, but I'm learning as well.
Well, I mean, I guess that's also why I think people discredit how difficult it is to do like something like stand-up comedy, for example, where a lot of it is improv. But for example, when I was in high school, I did a musical like Annie.
Oh, wow.
And I played Mr. Warbucks. For everybody on record, I will not release that video. But you know, I really do think that actually sort of gave me a lot of the confidence just to be on stage and to be a little loose. Typically, especially in our industry, you know, it's when we're presenting, you know, the pitch, or, you know, you have a pitch deck and everything's linear, and, you know, start with this and end with this and end with a call to action. It's so often linear, whereas improv, it's kind of like you just feel a little loose, right? Like it's more creative in a sense, and you can express yourself in a more free form.
Sure.
So kudos to you for that. I'm sure that, you know, it's obviously challenging, though. It's not an easy thing to do.
You know, once I made that switch, not seeing introversion as a weakness, so this is who I am and this is how I've got to approach, let's say, a networking event, I've kind of made a game of it now. You made the point about, you know, there's a script you follow and it gets kind of tedious. I completely agree. When you're at a networking event, you ask the typical questions. Hey, George, where do you work? What do you do? And beyond the superficial, it's really tough, especially when you have 500 people there, right? Yeah. So the game that I make of it is, in an evening of networking, I want to have at least 3 meaningful conversations that dip below the superficial, hey, business card exchange, what do you do?
Right.
And that game of chasing the 3 meaningful conversations makes every networking event a little bit more engaging for me as an introvert.
And so I love that. I want to also segue into the fact that you know, what you're doing now has a lot to do with research, right? A lot of the community watching this as well come from either entrepreneurial backgrounds. They have startups. Some are early, some are mid, some are late stage. I know you're super passionate about the space, Darrell, and you're very good at what you do. Seriously, and just, I mean, since we have you, want to leverage your insights as to what you're seeing right now in Canada. You know, with the VC space, we've talked about, I guess, all the other verticals, but I just want to focus in Canada right now. I guess my question is, how is the capital raising environment? And is it advantageous for people who actually are founding startups?
Sure. So the short answer to your question is, it is amazing. It's awesome to be an entrepreneur right now in Canada. The long answer is, I compare it to when I worked under Mary about 10 years ago. And the environment back then was very different. You didn't have, the startup ecosystem was still very early on. It almost was, when I think about a young person graduating from university back then, entrepreneurship was not an option for them. It wasn't the most pursued option. Whereas now, young people, the startup community, it's sexy to be an entrepreneur, right? So very different. So there's more people, critical mass of people pursuing entrepreneurship to begin with. And then the ecosystems, especially in the big cities like Kitchener-Waterloo, Toronto corridor, there's Montreal, Vancouver. Those areas have done an amazing job in bringing together entrepreneurs with accelerators, with funding, with VCs. So these random knocks of people in the right ecosystem are creating some amazing outputs in terms of successful companies like Wealthsimple, like Atomic Labs. You see a lot of that happening, more so than 10 years ago. So I think it's just amazing to see the growth in that
space. It's funny. I mean, you bring up, I guess you bring up this point where 10 years ago, entrepreneurship was not as romanticized as it is today. I would even say humorously, like entrepreneurship was pretty much unemployment.
Sure.
Back in the day, at least that's how some of my family members saw it. But it definitely is interesting to see more of that demand. So I guess a counter question to that is, there's more entrepreneurs. Is capital ramping up at the same speed, and is it plentiful enough to support the startups in Canada?
I would say absolutely yes.
Okay.
There's more choice out there. So yes, you have the traditional venture capitalists, and some companies is private equity, but you're not asking about those types of companies. But if you look at where you work, TSX, I mean, look at the way that you guys have pivoted around, what was traditional public companies mature,
right.
Whereas now you have TSX Venture, you have startups, you're launching a platform, I believe, pretty soon, targeting that. So there are many options. VC debt never existed back 10 years ago, whereas now it's a evolving asset class. So I would say that from an entrepreneur standpoint, there's a lot of choice out there, whereas 10 years ago there was venture capital, very selective, not enough money to support critical mass of startups.
Can you give us some numbers? I know. Obviously, I want to talk a bit about, and if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you go to CVCA. They have an amazing report that Darrell and the team sort of produce. Just some quick figures for the audience, sort of listening and tuning in. Where are you seeing the most demand? I mean, we know this, obviously, Ontario. If you really go micro, it's Montreal, Toronto, Ottawa, Vancouver. Those are kind of the hubs. But can you give us some figures, some light as to where most of it is coming from?
Sure. Well, we just released our 2017 year-end report last week, and 3.5 billion was invested in 2017 in venture capital. Just to give you a sense of relative, that's for most that's been invested in venture capital since the financial crisis, 2008, and more importantly, it isn't a bubble. It's been a very steady increase since 2008. So it's legitimate. I mean, I think it's a very healthy sign of an ecosystem that is developing and pacing itself just right. Because I remember the heydays of 10 years ago where we'd have spikes up and then the next year it'd be drought. We're not seeing that level of activity compared to 10 years ago.
I do want to make the point, because I do hear this often, is, George, look, I've tried to raise capital. I've tried to contact VCs, angels, and although there are many, I haven't gotten as much reception in Canada as I would in the US. So, sorry, man, I'm in the corner. I have to either go to, to the Valley or some, maybe New York, some of the big capital centers in the US, like Boston as well, just to access the different pool of capital. Do you still feel, that that's heavily present?
So I'll answer your question by circling back to the earlier part of our conversation, in terms of networking and building relationships.
Right.
Because entrepreneurs have to realize that it's not automatic. You may have a best business pitch in the world on a PowerPoint deck, but if you can't relate to another human being and be able to convince them that you are very passionate about this and you believe in it, that's a human interaction. That's not a pitch deck anymore. I remember 10 years ago, I was in Silicon Valley and I was in an elevator with one of the prominent VCs there, and I asked him this question. I mean, you get pitched a million times. How do you decide that? Are you A or are you B? And he goes, what it boils down to, man, is I trust the person. And trust isn't something you can deliver on a pitch deck. Trust is something you build through a conversation. And maybe not just one conversation, maybe 15 conversations over 3 years. But that ability is something that is absolutely fundamental to getting funding. And it takes patience. So if you're getting frustrated as an entrepreneur that you're knocking on doors and the one conversation doesn't result in funding, it's the approach. You got to start to look at how you're doing it, how you're actually conveying your idea to another human being.
I love that. There's one point I really want to make, sort of like I just want to really focus on. So you made the point that it's not just easy. Like, it's not going to come to you on a silver platter, right? I think what we're seeing also a lot in the tech space is a lot of entrepreneurs nowadays are focusing on raising money instead of generating revenue, right? So are you seeing that divide? And if so, I mean, does that lead to a bubble? Because I think, you kind of have to argue that it has become a little bit easier, in the sense of like securing a Series A, Series B. For a lot of companies, they're pre-revenue. So what is like just what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an investor myself, but I have heard investors say the formula that they use when they decide on a round of funding to an entrepreneur, that they believe it. They've now trusted this person. They think that they're going to achieve their goals, is that they want to give them enough funding for at least 2 years of runway to be able to, achieve some milestones. If you're getting less funding than a 2-year runway, I think you're setting yourself up for being in constant fundraising mode, which doesn't help your business, to your point, right? You're trying to raise funds as opposed to grow your business. So your plan has to be a long run, 10 years. In between, you gotta have milestones that your partner investor will agree to. But ultimately, it's give yourself enough time to focus on hitting those milestones and growing your business.
Interesting. One of the things too you mentioned, which I really want to touch upon, is the trust factor, right? I'm sure you also, I mean, we go to the same conferences, the same events, and you see a lot of entrepreneurs pitching and trying to get in contact with VCs when they're trying to raise capital. What advice would you give on that point to someone watching this who's actually undergoing the process?
So I'll tell you first what to not do.
Okay.
And then I'll tell you, I think, what works for me. The cold call is the worst way. The worst way, if you are sending blast emails to a number of VCs, the same email,
like a template.
Absolutely, templates. Chances are you're not going to get a response. Chances are they haven't even opened your email. And if you're getting frustrated, it's because the approach is just the wrong one. Because you can't build trust through a blast email, right? The best advice I can give you is to start to network within the industry. If you know another CEO, a colleague, another startup founder that has gotten VC funding, make them your best friend. Because if they can give you a warm handshake into a VC, that VC will take the meeting. So there's a community of very successful startup founders in Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal. Get to know them, be part of that community. Because the introduction from someone who has received VC funding is the best way in to get to that 30-minute or 1-hour meeting with the VC.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think the sort of warm lead is much easier. And those templates, because as you said, all you need is that 5 minutes, right? Like, just get me through the door. And then if you meet sort of face to face, then I guess we'll make magic happen. What sort of, like you mentioned events and networking opportunities, obviously for a founder watching this, but what I hear often is, that's great, George, but I also have a business to run, to grow, to build. And so they often see that as a waste of time. And I'm not sure if you've heard that feedback, but I do hear it often. So sometimes founders are either focused on that, or they just sort of brush it off and say, no, I'm going to focus on executing and building and keep that to the side.
Sure. And that attitude isn't specific to just founders. I see that. I do a lot of volunteering with newcomers to Canada, and I keep telling them the same advice. Network your way into that job. And they're like, well, it's a waste of time. I mean, I'm not going to get my job tomorrow if I network. And it takes a lot of patience. But I say, even now, I mean, I have a job, a full-time job, but for me, I actually fix in my networking component, and I have 2 coffees a week. That's my goal, at least 2 coffees a week with someone I know or someone I haven't touched base with for 6 to 8 months. Nice. It's a way of life today, right? You can never rely on, if you have a full-time job and that being permanent, that's number one. And you can never rely, if you have a startup that you're trying to grow, that networking is going to happen overnight. It's got to be part of your practice. And yes, I understand you're going to be spending a lot of hours building your business, but you need to carve the time out for the networking component, because it will lead to good things in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, you almost have to see it as you said, as part of your role, because there really is value out of that. And to your point, like just setting some targets, like doing 2 coffees a week, which is nice. And I think the sort of saying I say is power is people. I guess the more people you know, the more power you have, in a positive context. And the reason is, if I know you, for example, first of all, if there's anything that I can think of that you and I can work on, it's much easier to pick up the phone and say, hey Darrell, what's going on, man? All good? Versus, Darrell, hi, this is George from the TSF, right? So I guess the intro is much more informal, which leads to sort of quicker decisions. But also, I can provide more value to you, because if I meet someone else, for example, and they want to connect to someone, for example, in your world, I just make the connection happen, and I provide value through that.
Yeah. And I'm the same way. And when we met for a coffee, George, I think it was last week or the week before, I mean, that skill, I mean, you have it in droves. I think I have it too, but that skill is something that you probably worked toward getting. It wasn't something you were born with. My guess is that. But finding something that you have in common with someone else is part of that networking ability, I think. And we discovered through our coffee conversation, we had a lot in common. Absolutely, right? But that curiosity about someone, outside of what do I want to get out of this conversation, I think that's very much part of the element of building trust.
That's so critical, man. And even more so, I think when you live in cities, a lot of relationships are transactional. I sit down with you, the first thing I want to know is, Darrell, what can you do for me? And not only people to people, I think a lot of businesses have this issue where all they're doing is product pushing. And my question to a lot of the companies is, well, what value are you providing up front? Because the notion that you think that you own the client is very, very incorrect. The client always owns you because now they have options, but they also have transparency with things like social media. And so you're always on the back burner in most cases.
Yeah, I put myself in the shoes of the receiving end of being on a transactional. I mean, it serves a purpose, but I don't feel good about that.
Yeah.
I think it was Maya Angelou that said, any conversation you have with someone, 15, 20 years down the road, you will not remember the details of what you talked about. You will remember how you felt at the end of that. And I always remember that as something that is critical to any conversation I'm having is make the person feel supported and trusted, so that, I mean, this is a long arc of a relationship. This isn't a one-time thing where I'm trying to get something out of you. That's the best advice I would ever give anyone. Not only in the startup community, just in general. Yeah.
In general, try to connect, and that's what we did at first. I think that's probably the best way to do it. If you can resonate on a personal level, then a lot of things happen. A quick quote I always say, and I think I've said it before in podcasts, so if you're listening to this again, I'm sorry, but it's by Jeffrey Gitomer, who has the 12.5 Principles of Sales. It's a small little red book. At the back of the book, you'll find a great quote. It's my favorite one for sales. It says, "A sale will earn you a commission, but a friendship will earn you a fortune."
Yeah.
And
that's
so
true,
right? It just goes a long way. Part of having that empathy, though, Darrell, I think you'll resonate with this, is that you've traveled to different places, right? So we talked about some of the major cities. How was that for you? Was it difficult? I'm sure someone probably listening to this might have that inkling they're thinking of moving or something. Can you give us just a quick rundown of those cities? What happened? Where did you go?
Absolutely. So I would say the place I felt the most foreign in was Shanghai. Just because a lot of people outside of the office itself didn't speak English. And I had the very real experience of not going into a restaurant and not being able to order something because everything was in Chinese, or I had to point to pictures to be able to say, this is what I want. And I know what it feels like to be like an immigrant who doesn't speak English coming to Canada, for example, because that experience is eye-opening. Right? Because I consider myself an educated person, but if you can't communicate the basic stuff because you don't speak the language, that felt like a very educational experience to me, a very humbling experience. So I have a lot of respect as a result of that, people that come to Canada from all parts of the world, and they try and make a new life here. So what I learned from that experience traveling around the world is that human beings are human beings. We talked about trust earlier. How do you build that? It doesn't matter if we're sitting in China or we're sitting in London or New York. Human beings are human beings. You got to find a way to be able to connect with them, and it's the same. It really is. So I always look for, what do we have in common? Start with that and build from there. Whether this is going to be a long-term successful financial relationship or a personal relationship, it doesn't matter. You start with common build.
I love that. One of the things I wanted to ask as well, because you're very well traveled. Favorite sort of city, favorite country, anything towards that?
It's like picking your favorite child, right? If I were pressed on that, I went to Nepal and I hiked the base camp of Mount Everest. But the people that I met in Nepal, unbelievably happy relative to me, and with so very little in terms of what they own. And that really left a mark with me in terms of you don't have to have a lot to be happy. So I would say that because of the market left on me as a person, they're my favorite place in the world.
Wow. And I just actually remembered something because you were saying this, but when we had coffee, you mentioned that you're going to go on a retreat, right?
Oh, yeah.
Please mention that. So it's a yoga retreat, but it's a silent retreat as well. So there's no talk. It just explain it to us.
Sure. So actually, it's coming up in less than 2 weeks.
There you go. It's good to be going now.
It's a 10-day silent meditation retreat. No yoga, no books, no phones, no eye contact, no talking to people in the Vipassana, is what it's called, Vipassana retreat. The goal is really you get in touch with yourself and you try and sit with that for the longest, 10 days. Wow. And I've been talking to a lot of people who have done it, and they've made it through the 10 days, but they say that it's really tough. Days 0 to days 4 to 8, roughly. Some people have broken down because they couldn't take any more of this. And yet, when they pushed through that point, they came out of it feeling, wow, I mean, it's just a new appreciation of life. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm a little bit nervous about that breakdown period. I know it's going to happen, but just being disconnected from a phone, for me, I think that would be the most uncomfortable experience.
Yeah, I don't know how much I would fare. Although I honestly do think it's very valuable in the sense that sometimes you just need to step away, and just live in silence. I think what I'm sort of privy to this too, but in a world full of distractions, right? And I think for a lot of people, this is more psychological, but you might appreciate this. I think we're kind of scared to sit alone. If you really think about it, like we all have a job, right? So you finish from your job, you go home. What's the first thing you do? You either put on music, you turn on the TV, Netflix, or you're sort of distracted with something, right? If you have family, you have kids, or your wife, or whatever the context is. Then I'm going to go to the gym. That's an hour there. You come back, you put on the TV again, or you're doing emails, and so you're constantly distracted. But actually sitting alone, I think a lot of people might have issues with this for whatever psychological reasons. But it's an interesting test to you to learn more about yourself, to reflect on things that you actually appreciate, you value, things you can improve on. So that's amazing for you, man. I definitely want to get some feedback.
We should have a follow-up coffee at least when I come back.
If it goes well, I'm going to do that. But one of the things before we end this, Darrell, I really appreciate your insights so far. I always leave the podcast with this, which is one tip or piece of advice you give to someone right now watching this. What would it be?
Are you talking startup community or generally? Wow, it's so difficult when you say give one. There's so much I want to.
You can give a couple. I mean, if they're related, just go for it.
I would say the best advice I would give anyone would be, what I said before is I think in this world, in this time, in this age, we have so much politics, so many world issues going on. People focus on differences. How am I different than someone else? I say do the opposite. Even if someone violently disagrees with you, or let's take the political spectrum, someone on opposite ends of the spectrum from you, you should still be able to sit down and have a conversation with them without demonizing them because of preconceptions. Ultimately, try and discover through curiosity what you have in common with them. Now, I guarantee you will have more in common with them than you give yourself credit for. So the best advice I can say is give yourself the space to have those conversations with people you disagree with.
I love that. That's awesome advice. Darrell, thank you so much for doing this, man. For everybody watching too, if you do want to connect with Darrell, please do check out the CVCA website. His LinkedIn profile is also attached below for anybody who wants to connect with Darrell. Amazing guy, really. And yeah, thanks for making this episode amazing.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, George.
Cheers. All right, everybody. Take care.